But at the same time, regarding those unique identifiers, I would like to warn you that if you think, okay, my database generates this unique identifier, I may decide that I will expose this unique identifier and show it on my reports. It's kind of cool idea to say, okay, we have those database records. Look, they all have unique identifiers. And so my report looks pretty cool with those identifiers displayed. Before you know it, some important user, like this boss that we mentioned earlier on, boss of this company may say, well, you know what? We're actually using those identifiers in our payroll calculation. Say, oh, really? I didn't know that. And by the way, now we want you to change those identifiers. That's a big and significant request. Because remember where those unique identifiers may have originated. In the database engine. You don't control that process. Therefore, a warning. Whenever the user mentions an identifier, do not assume that this is the identifier that you're using internally. What it really means is that we're going to give them a data field on the data entry form and say, okay, if you're entering this new record, we may actually generate it for you and you can change it, but this is nothing to do with automatically generated identifiers internally by the system, including unique identifiers of database records generated by the database engine. Just kind of sharing you this experience that very often people say, oh, this is cool. We can just bring it in and make it, report all these unique identifiers. Don't do that. Never show the user any internal parts of the system. If they need something like that, create it for them, maintain it for them. You can have a separate database table that all of it does, it generates unique identifiers. And you can just grab those identifiers and give them to the user and say, okay, go ahead, use it. If you don't like it, change it, right? You can have validation for it as well and say, if it's already exists, we are not going to accept it. If it doesn't exist, then that's okay. We can accept it as a unique identifier. So be very careful with those identifiers, because a lot of software, a lot of database engines routinely generate, sequential or random identifiers for different parts. So it's easy to say, oh, we just can rely on those. But in reality, don't do that. Well, anyway, in my exploration of this particular document, what I just did was that I highlighted in green the record identifier, because I'd like to say, remind myself that when I read it again, this clearly goes into one of the data attributes which seems to be a part of many different classes that we're going to create here. Employee will have it, other parts of the system will have it. Now, unique record identifier should be used when updating or deleting existing time slots in the schedule. What it means is that, by the way, when we say updating, another thing here too, I'm not really highlighting it, but just reminding you that right here, updating could be another use case. One use case could be to create brand new entry. Another use case could be to modify an existing entry or update an existing or delete an existing entry, right? So those could be different use cases, and the user may have to choose a different menu, and the interface with the user will also be different. So clearly those are suddenly, out of nowhere, you're discovering two more use cases in the system just by reading it down the line and going over it. So but what it says here, that instead of specifying an employee name and time slot and everything, they may have already printed the report and they want to get rid of time slot identified by T13-5. They can type that in and they can, if that's a valid identifier, you can give them a warning and then go ahead and remove that from the schedule, right? So again, just another level of information specific to those identifiers and what is the expectation of the user to make them useful and how this can be, what role they will play. And it seems like the rest of this specification, since this is a really a record-keeping system, right? Yes, we have a weekly schedule, which is sort of like current, but we also have history. Today is going to be history tomorrow, and a week ago, and a month ago, and a year ago. So if we have an incident or something that we need to investigate, something took place, right? We need to keep record according to the actually federal regulations. All of the firms have to retain a set of records for a number of years. And so obviously for that purpose and other purposes, an audit history of all changes and updates in the system can be organized and kept in a database as well. So for that reason, yet again, another set of use cases surfaces to run audit trail reports. Essentially history. Show me the history. So you can say, display what kind of change took place. Someone created a new entry or updated it or deleted it, right? Or they can say, give me all changes in the system, you know, based on particular date and time. Just for this particular date and time, give me information about all changes that took place. Right? So this typically is another burden on the database programmer and database administrator, because they need to be aware of those data columns and how to organize them and how to update them and so forth. But it's pretty reasonable from the user perspective, right? We want to know the user who entered the data, employee names, and so forth. So all of these could be selection and sorting fields in those audit trail reports. In other words, historical reports on the changes that took place. Have a separate file with dictionary table of employee names. Clearly, employee name is just another attribute, right? I'm not going to, it's so obvious that I'm not going to even highlight it in green, because yes, of course, you're going to have an employee ID, employee other fields, including the name, to be able to enter them. Positions with the company. Well, perhaps this is just pretty useful because it's so specific. Let's make them green, I guess, just to say, oh yes, this is a set of attributes. Position, employee name, these are clearly attributes. Now, in this document, it's not immediately obvious which class those attributes will go to, but it's context specific, right? We're talking about an employee, and those in the employees will have those data attributes. So we would like to keep track of this and be able to basically make it stand out when we read this documentation. Because we read it today, we're going to be reading it a week from now, and it's useful to have some of those highlights in the document. Now, the table also should have a flag authorizing the user to have capability to schedule time slots, capability to run only to run reports, or capability to do both. So yet another attribute which basically sounds like a user privilege, right? So the user can have different privileges in the system based on who you are. So most likely we're going to have some sort of a login screen in the application, right? So they can identify themselves, who this user is, and then depending on what their capabilities or privileges are, we will display different set of menus for them perhaps. And finally, when entering a time slot, search last week's entries with the same day of the week for the person's name. If present, print the record on the screen in the user-friendly format. So this should facilitate schedule operations by providing a quick option to duplicate last week's records. So basically, just by entering time slot, it could print last week's, because it could be, you know, a weekly based schedule and so forth. Just a little bit of an optimization. Now, well, guess what? If we have this, maybe, if we have it described as a separate use case in the system, then we could give this a lower priority, right? So this is like, oh, all right. So we have already a working system, and we want some additional functionality.